Jesus told this parable to a crowd. Then he walked away. He did not explain it. He did not follow up with application points. He did not ask the crowd to raise their hands if they identified with a particular kind of soil. He told the story. And then, according to Mark's account, he got into a boat and left. Only later, in private, did his disciples come to him confused. And what he said to them is one of the most unsettling things he says anywhere in the Gospels. In Mark chapter 4, verses 11 through 12, Jesus says that the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to them. But to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may keep seeing, but never truly perceive. They may keep hearing, but never truly understand. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. Read that slowly. Jesus is quoting Isaiah chapter 6, the passage where the prophet is commissioned to preach to a people whose hearts have already hardened. Their ears have already closed. Their eyes have already grown dull. And Jesus applies that passage to his own preaching, not as a failure, as a diagnosis. The parable, in other words, is not only about 4 types of soil. The parable itself is doing what it describes. It is landing differently on different people in the same crowd. Some are hearing a farming story. Some are hearing something that will take root slowly and change everything. And some are already deciding it does not apply to them. That is the detail that makes this parable genuinely uncomfortable. The detail that 2,000 years of neat application outlines have smoothed over until it no longer cuts. The parable is not mainly about whether you received the word. Almost everyone in the crowd received the same words. The parable is about what the word encountered when it arrived. It is about the interior condition of the person hearing. It is about the soil. And the most uncomfortable thing about soil is this: you did not choose your starting condition, but you are not stuck with it either. This is that story. To hear the parable of the sower, the way the crowd on the shore of the Sea of Galilee heard it, you need to stand where they were standing, not only geographically, but historically and theologically. It is approximately 28 A.D. The crowd gathering by the lakeside in Capernaum is not one simple religious audience. It is a cross-section of first-century Jewish Galilee, fishermen and tax collectors, farmers and craftsmen, Pharisees and their critics, people carrying the weight of Roman occupation, and also the weight of a religious establishment that had translated that occupation into layers of legal obligation, layers that ordinary people could barely navigate. They have come to hear Jesus. And by this point in the narratives of Mark chapter 4, Matthew chapter 13, and Luke chapter 8, Jesus has been doing things that have no precedent in living memory: healing diseases, casting out what the text calls unclean spirits, forgiving sins with personal authority, not interceding for forgiveness, not directing people back to the temple system, but pronouncing forgiveness directly. The scribes immediately recognized this as either blasphemy or something they had no category for. Jesus has also been announcing, again and again, the arrival of something called the kingdom of God, the reign of God, the sovereign rule of the God of Israel breaking into the present moment. The crowd has heard these things. Some of them have witnessed them, and they are trying to figure out what to do with what they have seen and heard. That is the precise moment Jesus chooses to tell a farming story. The agricultural setting is not decoration. The region around the Sea of Galilee was farming country. The crowd would have understood every detail from direct experience. The path worn hard by foot traffic cutting through a field. The thin layer of soil over limestone bedrock on the hillsides. The thorn bushes that competed aggressively with cultivated crops. And the deep, rich soil of the valley floors that produced the harvests that sustained whole communities. But there is a deeper agricultural background beneath the surface of the parable. The crowd, steeped in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, would have recognized it immediately. In Isaiah chapter 55, verses 10 through 11, God compares his word to rain and snow that come down from heaven. They water the earth. They make it bud and flourish. They give seed to the sower and bread to the eater. In the same way, God says, his word will not return to him empty. It will accomplish what he desires. It will achieve the purpose for which he sent it. The Word of God as seed. The promise that the Word does not fail. Isaiah had said it centuries before Jesus sat in that boat. The crowd that knew their scriptures heard the echo. And that echo immediately raises the question the parable will hold in tension from beginning to end. If the Word does not return empty, why does it so often seem to? The parable is short enough to quote in full. That matters. Jesus is not working with a complex allegory that requires a manual to decode. He is working with one image, a farmer scattering seed, and 4 variations on what happens next. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 3 through 9, Jesus says that a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he scattered the seed, some fell along the path. The birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where there was not much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched. They withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns. The thorns grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil. There it produced a crop, 100 times, 60 times, or 30 times what was sown. Then Jesus said, "Whoever has ears, let them hear." 4 soils, 1 farmer, 1 seed, and then the instruction. Whoever has ears, let them hear. That phrase is itself a curiosity gap, because it implies that having ears is not enough. You also have to let them hear. The hearing is not automatic. Something inside the listener has to permit it. The first detail that changes the meaning of the parable is the farmer's behavior. He is not a careful, targeted planter, placing seeds only in pre-selected, ideal locations. He is scattering. The Greek word is a form of spero. It suggests ongoing action. He is broadcasting the seed broadly, indiscriminately, with what looks, from one angle, like carelessness, and from another angle, like extraordinary generosity. The seed lands on the path, on the rocks, in the thorns, on good soil. The farmer does not pre-screen the ground. That is theologically significant, and we will come back to it. But first, the soils. The path is ground so compacted by foot traffic that the seed cannot penetrate the surface at all. The birds take it before it can begin. In Jesus' own interpretation, the birds represent the evil one, the adversary who snatches away what was heard before it can take any root. The rocky ground is soil over limestone. This was common throughout Galilee. The bedrock sits only inches below the surface. The seed germinates immediately because the shallow soil is warm. The moisture is trapped close to the surface. Growth is fast, but it is also hollow. When the summer sun hits the hillsides and the moisture evaporates, the roots have nowhere deeper to go. They find nothing. The plant collapses. The thorny ground produces a real conflict. 2 plants competing for the same resources. The seed germinates. The plant grows. But it is not alone. The thorns grow beside it. The word for thorns carries an echo of Genesis chapter 3, where thorns are named as part of the curse upon the ground. Here too, the thorns grow, and eventually they overpower the plant. Then there is the good soil. It produces in numbers the crowd would have found almost fantastical. 100 times, 60 times, 30 times what was sown. Normal agricultural yields in first-century Palestine were far smaller. A good year might produce 5-fold or 10-fold. 100-fold was the kind of number associated in the Hebrew scriptures with divine blessing. Genesis chapter 26, verse 12, records Isaac receiving 100-fold harvest during a famine, a sign of God's favor. So the good soil is not merely productive. It is extravagantly productive, supernaturally productive. The word that lands in it does not simply survive. It multiplies beyond what the soil alone could explain. The parable is called the parable of the sower, and almost every sermon, Bible study, and Sunday school lesson about it focuses on the seed, what it is, where it lands, what it produces. The sower often fades into the background, a delivery mechanism, and the drama plays out among the soils. But look carefully at what Jesus says in private to his disciples. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 18, he tells them to listen to what the parable of the sower means. And then he immediately stops talking about the sower. The sower performs the action. Then he recedes. The sower is constant. The same farmer, the same seed, the same broadcasting motion across all 4 soils. What varies is not the sower. What varies is not the seed. What varies is only the soil. This reframing is what makes the parable uncomfortable. Because in the version many people prefer, the central drama is about the quality and power of the message. Get the message right. Preach it clearly. Communicate it persuasively, and the results will follow. In that version, the sower becomes the hero, the preacher, the evangelist, the ministry, and success is measured by the harvest produced. But Jesus is not telling that story. Jesus is telling a story in which the sower's generosity is assumed and constant. The seed's quality is assumed and constant. And the only variable, the only thing the parable invites you to examine, is the interior condition of the one who hears. The question is not, was the word sown well? The question is, what kind of ground are you? And that question is harder. Because evaluating the sower's technique is comfortable. You can critique it. You can improve it. You can feel superior to it or frustrated by it. But examining your own soil requires something else entirely. Jesus' interpretation of the first soil is precise. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 19, he says that when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in the heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The path is hard because it has been walked on, repeatedly, by many feet, over a long time. The compaction is not the result of one bad decision. It is the result of accumulated traffic. The slow accumulation of things that press down and down and down until the surface becomes impenetrable. What makes a human heart like a hard path? The text does not give a full list. But the agricultural metaphor points in a specific direction. Paths become hard through use, through the traffic of ordinary life, through everything that crosses a person's interior landscape day after day. Disappointments that harden into cynicism, promises that did not deliver and left scar tissue behind. Exposure to religious language used manipulatively or performatively until the words themselves lost their capacity to mean anything. The grinding pressure of surviving inside systems that take more from you than they return. Nobody chooses a hard heart the way someone chooses a hairstyle. The path is hard because something walked on it long enough, and often enough, to compress it beyond normal receptivity. And one of the cruelest aspects of the hard path is that the person who has it often does not know it is there. The surface looks flat and clear. The seed disappears so quickly, taken by the birds before it can even begin. So the person sitting on the path never has a sustained experience of resistance to examine. The word just does not seem to land. It never seemed relevant. It never seemed personal. It came and went, and it left nothing. The theological question underneath this soil is one the parable opens, but does not immediately close. If the path became hard through circumstances the person did not entirely choose, through suffering, corrupted religion, or decades of difficult living, what is the moral weight of that hardness? Is the hard path guilty? Jesus does not answer that question directly in the parable. He describes, he does not condemn. The farmer scattered seed on the path too, the same seed, with the same generosity, just as he did on the good soil. Of the four soil types, the rocky ground is the one many people are most afraid to recognize in themselves, and it is the one the contemporary Western church has been most structurally vulnerable to producing. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 20 through 21, Jesus says the seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. But because they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Read that carefully. This is not a person who was uninterested. This is not a person who was hostile. This is a person who received the word with joy, someone who responded immediately, enthusiastically, visibly. From the outside, this person looked like a stunning example of what the word can do. The problem was invisible, underground. In the substrate no one could see from the surface, there was bedrock, something hard and unyielding beneath the thin layer of responsive soil. And when the sun came, when the heat arrived, when the cost became real, when the word began to demand something, instead of simply offering something, The plant had nowhere to draw from. The Greek word translated as falling away is related to the idea of being scandalized, to stumble, to be caused to trip. The same root is connected to a trap, a snare, or a stone in the path. Something that seemed to be a path forward becomes a point of stumbling. This is the soil that produces immediate joy, and that is the detail that cuts. Because in a culture that has learned to measure spiritual health by the intensity of an initial emotional response, rocky ground can look almost identical to good soil. At least, in the short term. It grows fast. It looks alive. It produces the right responses in the right settings, until the sun comes, until the moment requires not only enthusiasm but root. The rocky ground is not produced by an emotional response to the word. Emotion is not the problem. The bedrock underneath it is the problem. The thing below the surface that prevents depth. And what creates that bedrock varies. Sometimes it is a transactional theology, a relationship with God built entirely on what God provides, rather than on who God is. So when provisions stops, or suffering arrives, the whole structure has nothing holding it. Sometimes it is a faith that has been entirely social, entirely dependent on community. So, when that community is removed, or disappoints, or fractures, there is nothing left that was ever personal. Sometimes it is simply the absence of practices that build root systems, the slow, unglamorous disciplines of attention, honesty, and returning to the word on ordinary days when nothing dramatic is happening. The sun does not create the problem. The sun reveals it. The third soil speaks most directly to the conditions of the world in which many people are living right now. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 22, Jesus says, "The seed falling among thorns refers to someone who hears the word. But the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, so it becomes unfruitful." Two thorns, only two, the anxiety of the age and the deceitfulness of wealth. Between them, they account for a vast number of reasons why people who are genuinely engaged with the word still fail to produce fruit. They are not hard-hearted. They are not without root. And yet, they become unfruitful. The thorny ground is not opposition to the word. That would be easier to recognize. The thorny ground is competition with the word. The thorns do not attack the plant. They simply grow beside it. They draw from the same soil. They reach for the same light. They consume the same resources. Until the legitimate plant, the one that was truly growing, is crowded out, not by hostility, but by the accumulated pressure of other things that also seemed legitimate. The worry of this life. The Greek word carries the sense of a divided mind, a mind pulled apart, an attention split in multiple directions at once. And in a world of endless information, endless connectivity, endless demands, endless news cycles, notifications, obligations, and opportunities, the divided mind is not unusual. It is the baseline condition. It is the air many people breathe. Jesus addressed this directly in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 6, he named anxiety about food, clothing, and tomorrow as the occupation of those who do not know the Father. The anxiety is not simply sin in the sense of transgression. It is a symptom of a deeper misalignment. Living as though the world's logic of scarcity and self-provision is the deepest truth, instead of the logic of a Father who sees, who knows, and who provides. The deceitfulness of wealth is subtler, more insidious. It deceives through pleasure, through the appeal of something that seems to offer what it cannot truly deliver. The thorn of wealth does not deceive by promising evil things. It deceives by promising good things: security, freedom, significance, the ability to help others. Then it delivers a version of those things that is just enough to keep the pursuit going, but never enough to satisfy the need that drove the pursuit in the first place. The thorny ground is not filled with people who rejected the word. It is filled with people who never quite got around to giving it the full attention it required, because there was always something else that also required attention. And the word patient and quiet, undemanding in the short term, kept getting moved to later. Later became never. The thorns did not kill the plant all at once. They crowded it until it stopped producing fruit. And from the outside, from a distance, A plant crowded into fruitlessness can look almost identical to a plant that never grew at all. The fourth soil often receives less attention than the first three, that is revealing. Jesus' description in Matthew chapter 13, verse 23, is spare. The seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop 100 times, 60 times, or 30 times what was sown. Hears and understands, not simply hearing the words, but grasping the meaning, taking in the significance, receiving not only the information, but the weight of it. The good soil is not defined only by the absence of obstacles. It is defined by a quality of reception, an active, penetrating engagement with what is being heard, not a passive presence near the words. But here is the question the parable opens and never explicitly closes, and it may be the most important question in the text. How does soil become good? The parable tells us how soil fails to be good. It is hard from compaction. It is shallow because of bedrock. It is crowded by competing growth. But the parable itself does not tell us how to move from one category to another. It describes the types. It does not give a renovation program. That silence is not an oversight. It is an invitation. Because if the parable ended with a 4-step soil improvement plan, it would become exactly the kind of thing rocky and thorny ground are vulnerable to. A new program to receive enthusiastically, or another item to add to the list things competing for attention, without the deeper work that real transformation requires. The parable ends where it began. Whoever has ears, let them hear. It ends with hearing, with the interior condition of reception, with what you bring to the encounter with the word, rather than what the word brings to you. That is the uncomfortable truth the parable has been building toward. Not that the word is inadequate, not that the sower failed, but that the word, with all its power, all its divine origin, and all the extravagance of a farmer who scatters it on paths and rocks and thorns, as well as good soil, still encounters the condition of the ground it enters. The agricultural imagery Jesus uses is not his invention. Tracing it backward through the Hebrew scriptures reveals that the parable of the sower is the culmination of a prophetic thread that had been building for centuries. Isaiah chapter 6, the passage Jesus quotes when explaining why he teaches in parables, is the commissioning of Isaiah. He is sent to preach to a people whose heart has grown dull, whose ears are heavy, whose eyes are closed. The diagnostic language is close to the hard path soil. The people are not ignorant of the word. They have been hearing it for generations. The problem is exactly what the parable describes: compaction through accumulated exposure without response. But Isaiah contains another agricultural passage that runs even deeper. In Isaiah chapter 28, verse 23 through 29, the prophet describes a farmer who does not plow the same soil continuously. He varies his methods, plowing here, broadcasting there, planting dill, cumin, and wheat according to what each requires. And the passage ends with an observation many readers have never noticed. In Isaiah chapter 28, verse 26, the prophet says that God instructs the farmer and teaches him the right way. The farmer's wisdom, the ability to read the soil and respond appropriately, is itself a divine gift. The parable of Jesus is not simply describing a static reality. It suggests that the reading of soil and the right response to it is something taught. Ezekiel adds the clearest trajectory. In Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26, God gives the great promise of restoration. He says he will give his people a new heart and put a new spirit within them. He will remove the heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. The heart of stone, the bedrock that creates rocky ground. God promises its removal, not through human effort, not through self-improvement, but through divine initiative. The soil transformation the parable leaves as an open question, Ezekiel answers with a promise. The hard, shallow, stone-covered ground can be changed, not by the farmer's technique, not by the quality of the seed, but by the action of the one who made the ground in the first place. Jesus stands at the intersection of Isaiah's diagnosis and Ezekiel's promise. He tells a parable that describes the reality honestly. 4 soils, most of them failing, and yet He stands there himself as the evidence that Ezekiel's promise is being fulfilled. His ministry is the arrival of the new heart, not as a doctrine to be merely understood, but as a presence to be encountered. The parable of the sower is, underneath everything else, a theology of interior life. It locates the primary arena of spiritual life not in outward behavior, not in what you do, not in how you perform, not in which rituals you observe, not in which obligations you fulfill, but in the interior condition from which behavior emerges. The soil is not what you produce. The soil is what you are, and what you are determines what you can receive. What you receive determines what you can become. This is uncomfortable for two very different kinds of religious instinct. For traditions that emphasize behavior, obligation, and external performance, insists that none of those things address the substrate. You can plant on rocky ground with extraordinary precision and still produce nothing. Because the problem is not the precision of the planting. The problem is the bedrock. You can clear thorns from around a plant and watch new thorns grow back. Because the problem is not only this thorn or that thorn. The problem is the soil's orientation toward thorns, toward the competing growths of anxiety and distraction that keep returning. For traditions that emphasize inner experience, feeling, emotional intensity, and personal encounter, the parable offers an equally uncomfortable correction. The rocky ground received the word with joy. The shallow soil produced rapid visible growth. Emotional response is not the measure of root depth. The sun tests what joy alone cannot. What the parable points toward, without naming it as a program, is the slow, patient, unglamorous work of becoming the kind of ground that can receive, hold, and produce. Not a technique, not a formula, a process. The kind Ezekiel describes as requiring divine initiative. The kind the New Testament describes through words like repentance, renewal, renovation, transformation from the inside out. The soil cannot improve itself. That is the honest reading of the metaphor. Soil does not simply decide to become deeper or less thorny, but soil can be tended. It can be broken up. The hard path can be plowed. It can be cleared. It can be turned. It can be exposed to the elements in ways that change its character over time. The farmer who scatters seed also plows. The same hands that broadcast generously can also break up hardness when the season requires it. The parable's silence about soil transformation is not the final word on the subject. It is the beginning of a conversation the rest of the New Testament continues. There is a question the parable of the sower plants in almost everyone who sits with it honestly. It is the question the parable is designed to leave unresolved in a productive way. Which soil am I? Most people, if they are honest, recognize elements of several soils in themselves across different seasons of life. The years when the word seemed to produce nothing, when the surface was hard and everything bounced off. The seasons of initial enthusiasm that did not survive the first serious heat. The long stretches of crowded attention, when the word was technically present in life, but overwhelmed by the competing growth of anxiety, ambition, and distraction. So it never produced what it might have produced. And perhaps, in some seasons, in some corners of the interior life, there was something like good soil. A place where something took root and actually grew, where the word did not merely arrive and depart. It stayed. It changed something. It produced something that multiplied in ways that could not be fully explained. The parable does not ask you to identify which soil you permanently are. Soil is not destiny. The parable asks you to look honestly at what is happening in the ground of your interior life right now. What is the condition of the path? Has it been compressed by too much traffic? Too much accumulated disappointment? Too much exposure to words that never meant what they claimed? What is the condition of the bedrock? Is there something beneath the surface that prevents depth? Something that makes growth fast, shallow, and fragile? What thorns are growing? What anxieties? What pursuits? What endlessly multiplying demands are competing with the word for the same finite interior resources? These are not comfortable questions. The parable does not make them comfortable. It makes them necessary. And underneath the necessity of the questions is the same generosity the farmer demonstrates throughout the parable. The seed keeps coming. On the path, on the rocks, in the thorns, on the good soil, the same seed, the same farmer, the same broadcasting generosity. Without pre-screening, without withholding from difficult ground, the word keeps arriving. The question the parable leaves you with is not whether it will come. It is what it will find when it does. If this video helped you encounter this parable differently, not as a comfortable taxonomy of other people's spiritual failures, but as a mirror that asks something true about the interior condition you bring to the Word, share it. There is someone in your life who has sat in the same pew or read the same pages for years and wondered quietly whether something is wrong with them, whether they are somehow incapable of what the Word seems to produce in other people. They need to know that Jesus told this parable too, and that the farmer keeps scattering seed, even on hard ground. Send this to them. If you are not subscribed, this is the moment. The parables of Jesus are not children's stories. They are compressed theologies that have been unfolding for 2,000 years, and we have only begun to excavate them. Subscribe. Stay close. The story is still being told, and you are part of it.